Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. On the show tonight,
our kids are happy to be back in school.
It's back to school in April for Chicago high school students. A look at learning during the pandemic.
We look for resources for our community.
After a weekend of protests in response to the police shooting of Adam Toledo, we talked with some of the community organizations in Little Village.
He asked for help with his very last breath.
Closing arguments and jury deliberations began in the murder trial of Derek Chauvin. Two attorneys break down the charges.
All Chicagoans over the age of 16 can now receive a COVID vaccine, but some issues remain.
A new deal for electronics maker Foxconn is in its final stages. That and more from Cranes.
A local child welfare organization says its anti-racism approach has made a big difference in outcomes for the children they serve.
And how telecommuting could spell big changes for Chicago area transit. But first, some of today's top stories. Mayor Lori Lightfoot is responding to the city's spate of shootings and violence, saying while she is satisfied with the work of Police Superintendent David Brown and the Chicago Police Department, more state and federal laws need to be passed.
Every year, the Chicago Police Department takes off the street more illegal crime guns than New York or LA combined. Why? Because of our proximity to states and cities that have very lax gun control laws.
The mayor says she's advocated for universal background checks, a ban on assault weapons, and denying people on the no-fly list from purchasing guns. Chicagoans could see the Illinois National Guard in the city tomorrow as Governor J.B. Pritzker has activated 125 guardsmen and women at the mayor's request. The governor's office says the Guard will be on standby to support the Chicago Police Department as we await a verdict in the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, who stands accused of killing George Floyd last summer. Officials also say the Guard will have a limited mission, managing street closures but not interfering with any peaceful protests. Mayor Lightfoot said she made the request to be fully prepared and out of an abundance of caution. There's more of this story on our website, and we'll have more on those closing arguments in the Chauvin trial later in the show. Public health officials say nearly 2,000 more people have been diagnosed with the coronavirus since yesterday, and 22 have died. The state's total case count passed 1.3 million over the weekend, and 21,685 people have died. More than 26% of residents have been fully vaccinated. And today is also the day that all Chicago residents ages 16 and over become eligible for a COVID vaccination. The city says already half of all residents have received at least a first dose. For more on the vaccine rollout in the city, please visit our website. And First Lady Jill Biden was in Illinois today, along with U.S. Education Secretary Miguel Cardona, to discuss the importance of community colleges.
Because without educated and trained workers, businesses can't build. Innovation is held back, and our economy drags. We can't afford to exclude so many from continuing their education just because they come from certain income brackets or certain areas.
The First Lady, who is also a community college professor, toured Sauk Valley Community College in Dixon with Cardona and Governor J.B. Pritzker. During the tour, they visited an engineering and nursing lab, speaking with students and professors about their training and the pandemic's impact. The Biden administration has advocated for free community college, and the First Lady celebrated Sauk Valley's efforts to do that through a funding model relying on partially corporate grants. The fourth quarter of the school year has begun for Chicago Public Schools, and only today were high school students allowed back into the classroom. Amanda Vinicki joins us now with more. Amanda.
Brandis, CPS students have had the opportunity to return to the classroom in waves. First, special education cluster students and pre-K students, then elementary. Finally, after 13 months of remote learning, CPS high school students had their chance.
But we fought very hard for this moment because we felt like it was very important and a question of basic equity for our students.
fought, as in CPS went through rounds of negotiations with the Chicago Teachers Union to get to this point. Instead of returning to classrooms last week for part of prepping like the district wanted, CTU members refused and worked remotely. But yesterday, 83% of union members who voted agreed to ratify a deal that allowed high school to start today as CPS had planned. CTU President Jesse Sharkey says high school is different than elementary school, and not just because the students are teenagers.
Students go and stay with a teacher. In high school, you go and you see 7 or 8 teachers over the course of the day. And so what that means from the pandemic is in elementary school, you got a pod. You're with the same kids and the same teacher all day long. High school, that's not the case at all. You have a completely different set of 30 or so students every single period of the day in high school. And so it means that, if you got that one kid who's, who turns out to have COVID, as they go through, they're going to see a lot of people.
Even crowded hallways, for example. Sharkey says that is why making sure that high schools don't exceed COVID capacities is crucial. And so why, even though high school is back, it is not fully so. Depending on school size and the number of students choosing to come in, students may be on campus for either 1, 2, or 4 days a week, not 5, no matter what. Wednesdays are remote learning. The memorandum between CPS and CTU also calls for 6 feet of social distancing as much as possible. That is, by the way, double the 3 feet now recommended by both the State Board of Education and the CDC. Other provisions in the agreement call for masking at all times and then metrics that would have schools shut down if there is a surge.
Well, today was probably the strangest first day of school I've ever had, but I can absolutely say it was really nice to see kids. I think there was a real sense of excitement that we're back. I think a lot of students were really happy to see us. And it's really funny because for a year now, I've had kids who I haven't seen, no cameras, no microphone, and I see kids like, wow, I didn't expect you to be this way. And so I think there's a little bit more of the magic that we as teachers are used to, we saw today.
Roberto Clemente history teacher Sam Texaca says he wasn't concerned for his safety at all being back in the building. He says the agreement that CPS and CTU came to does provide teachers with quality protection. He's also thankful for the work that janitors have done. He came prepared with extra sanitization equipment, wipes and such. He's also vaccinated and plans to encourage his students to do the same. That is another big part of this deal, a vaccination program for qualifying students as well as for their family members.
Certainly the CTU and CPS have had some sort of nationally famous conflict. But I think that sometimes what gets left out of that is that we have some pretty impressive advocacy for students. And I don't know of a single other district. In fact, we talked to the National Union of Teachers, the AFT, and we haven't heard of a single other district in this country that has a vaccination program for students. So we're very proud of that.
Now, Count Valencia Shorty is among those glad to be back in school. I caught her as she was leaving Roberto Clemente, and she says that she learned more on this first day back than she has the rest of her freshman year.
Like I got more done, got more help.
How has remote learning been?
I don't really pay attention. It's like I can't sit at a computer screen all day and just watch it.
I feel you there, Valencia. Shorty did say that being in the classroom was a bit strange. She has played on the school basketball team, but this was her first day actually in high school, and she didn't really know people. Now, teacher Sam Texera says most students actually don't turn on their computer cameras when they're in class online. He said he only had a handful of students in class today. He tried to talk to them individually if they need anything. He says he does expect to have more students tomorrow. Even as he is teaching them in person, teachers are also still having to teach the students who've opted to continue to learn remotely.
It's funny because I have a student teacher and I have a co-teacher for one class, and I said, my God, I don't know how we could do this if there weren't more adults here, because your natural sort of inclination is to help the young people in front of you. And as you're doing that, you sort of realize, oh, wait a minute, there's like 20 other kids out there that I need to help. It almost feels like being like a game show host. You're like, oh, there's our studio audience and there's you all. So trying to be conscious of that.
Now, he tried to ease those strange logistics of all of that by showing in the physical classroom whatever was going on in the remote classroom chat. Now, for all of those challenges, CPS Schools Chief Janice Jackson says that having students back in the classroom is a victory.
I count this as a success. My goal is to have every kid back in school full time. I want to return to normal, whatever that new normal is, but we're going to celebrate what happened today. We got our kids back in school. Our kids are happy to be back in school, and it is one step along a long process that will end with all of our kids having access to in-person instruction 5 days a week. That is the goal.
Progress, because with not 5 days a week now, some of these high school students will really only be in the classroom about 14 days before school's out for summer. And then there's also the matter coming up of helping students with the trauma of learning through the pandemic, learning loss, and then arrangements for fall.
And to do everything we can to get to the place in the fall where kids are able to come back and staff is able to come back, because I think it's really important that we are here physically. I think that's something we have to name and say that that's important, but also say that we have to follow the science in order to get us to that point.
We don't yet, by the way, have numbers from CPS on what attendance this first day back for in-classroom high school was. With that, Brandis, back to you.
Something we'll keep asking for, Amanda. Thank you. And now to Paris, and a look at how community members are responding to the events surrounding Adam Toledo's death. Paris.
Yeah, Brandis, thank you very much. Protesters took to the streets this weekend, both in Little Village and other parts of the city, after the Civilian Office of Police Accountability released videos of police fatally shooting 13-year-old Adam Toledo. Little Village has been in the spotlight over the last few weeks, as have conversations surrounding gang violence and disinvestment in that community. Today we hear from neighborhood organizations on the ground working to help residents, connecting community members and resources, and some violence prevention initiatives that they're working on as well. Joining us to discuss how the Little Village community is responding to the video and to talk about work community organizations are doing in the neighborhood are Solomon Martinez, Youth Program Manager at the Erie Neighborhood House in Little Village, Berto Aguayo, Executive Director of Increase the Peace, a violence prevention organization that has a chapter in Little Village, and Balthazar Enriquez, President of the Little Village Community Council. Welcome all of you to Chicago Tonight. Balthazar, several days now have passed since that video was released. What is the tenor of the community right now? What are you hearing from community residents in Little Village?
Well, first, thank you for inviting us. Our residents are, resilient. They're strong. It's a strong neighborhood. Seeing the video did hurt us a lot. Like, it broke us down to the core. And we're learning. We're learning from this experience, and we're moving on. We're moving on. We wiped our tears, and we know what we had to do to protect Little Village. Little Village, we are now moving forward to see if we can do policy changes with the mayor. See if the mayor really wants to come talk to real grassroots organizations, not organizations that she funds, that she runs, that she pimps. We don't need those type of organizations. We need real grassroots organizations that are in the streets, that know the members, that know the residents, and that's what the Little Village Community Council is.
All right,
so
expanding
we're
on
moving forward on policies.
Berto Aguayo, how does Little Village move forward, and what do you want from the mayor's administration to help that community heal?
Well, yeah, as Balthazar mentioned, we are in a transitional moment where we're turning our anguish into action. And yesterday was a pivotal moment in doing that. Organizations like Little Village Community Council and a lot of other organizations in Little Village came together to have a peace walk where more than 1,000 people showed out for the community to demand that we fund our neighborhoods, that we invest in violence prevention, jobs for our young people, housing, wraparound services. We've said enough is enough. The common denominator between police and street violence is disinvestment, and you can only solve that with investment. So that's what we're asking for, and we're not going to give up until we get it.
And Solomon, your organization works with a lot of youth in Little Village. Given that Adam Toledo was 13 years old, what has been the reaction from kids of a certain age, of a similar age?
For sure. And I think that a lot of people, not only youth, are coping with this reality in a lot of different ways. And one of the things that we see is, right, this is a single incident in a long history of community violence and state violence in Little Village. And so for a lot of youth, a lot of what they're trying to do is find that space where they feel good, where they feel whole, because this hurts, right? People are also trying to grieve, right? But they're grieving this amidst a lot of other things. And then they're also looking for that space where their rage and their passion can work towards change.
Baltazar, in Little Village, we've talked about the population of undocumented immigrants. There's a distrust of immigration agents, obviously, but how about police-community relations? Do you feel that most of the community there trusts the police, wants the police to protect their neighborhoods, or has a distrust of the police, especially in light of what happened or what we saw in that video last week?
So Little Village is the mecca of Mexican Americans, and we are the port of immigrants. And a lot of our residents don't know that they have the human right to find out who hurt them, to find out who was the aggressor. So in the Adam Toledo case, the reason we got this tape so quickly is because we educated our community that they have the right to a Freedom of Information Act. And that Freedom of Information Act is what moved this campaign forward on getting the tapes released. But the community doesn't know their rights. The community is scared or even complained that the police had harassed them or beat them up. And sometimes those things are not recorded or brought up to the light that these individuals have hurt them. And so, yeah, it's a mistrust already because immigration has already marginalized them. And now, again, you got the CPD department that is not family friendly, it's not community friendly. It's more of shoot first, ask questions later.
So maybe there's still a reticence among many residents to talk to any kind of law enforcement, be they ICE or be they police officers. Berto, there's been the issue of gang violence discussed in connection with this somewhat. Little Village is a very tightly knit community, but it also does struggle with a gang problem. Can you talk about what kind of presence gangs have in that community?
Yeah, one of the things that we know to be true, again, is that police and gang violence, street violence, have the same common denominator, disinvestment. When you look at communities like Little Village, like Back of the Yard, like Englewood, communities that have high levels of violence, they're also the very same communities with the highest levels of youth unemployment, right, where it's harder to find an after-school program to engage in, where it's harder to find a mental health clinic to go to. Little Village is one of those neighborhoods where you have 71% of young people that are unemployed, right? So in order for us to not have gangs fill the void that those things create, we need to be able to invest in our young people, give them an opportunity, give them some mentorship, some guidance, give them an art class, give them the ability to be able to figure out for themselves what is it they would like to be engaged in. Otherwise, gangs will fill that void. And in order for us to stop the violence, we need to invest in our young people and to fund the hood.
And Solomon, when you look at the age of Adam Toledo, right at that age where, it seems like he's kind of at a precipice to try and figure out what path he wants to go down. When you hear what Berto says there about the unemployment rate, disinvestment, how do you work with kids to help them, steer them away from the lure of going down that road?
Well, and gang involvement is way more complicated than there's not a job, so I'm joining a gang, right?
Right.
And I think that a lot of what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a community where people can dream and those dreams have impact, right? The thing that a youth wants to do is available for them. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of the youth in Little Village are constantly navigating is I want to do this, but I don't have this option. This is not available for me. And even within schools, a lot of the different vocational programs, a lot of the different after-school programs, they're tailored towards this narrative of what it means to be a good immigrant, to be a good person from the hood, versus really creating space for them to create their own dreams and then to actually access and take hold of those dreams. And so, right, I really want to echo what Berto said about the idea that we really need to invest in our youth. And what Jorge said, our youth are so resilient. This community is so resilient. And if the opportunity was available, people would take it and we would see that difference.
Certainly is resilient and close-knit. I spent a lot of time in Little Village. And earlier this afternoon, we spoke with Ane Botello, an 18-year-old from Little Village who led the peace walk that happened yesterday. Here's a clip about what she believes her community needs.
We need more resources, more mental health resources. We need activists, therapists, counselors. We need people who are for our people, not against our people. You know, we need people that can empathize, that can sympathize, that understand why we are the way we are and what we're going through, and actually see potential in us.
Baltazar, talking about opportunities, your organization, the Little Village Community Council, offers assistance for college preparedness, college readiness. Can you just talk about how important some of those programs are and what kind of impact you've seen in that community?
So, I mean, I'm going to use myself as an example. Like when I graduated from high school, my dad said, "Hey, man, that's enough of that free ride. It's time for you to work." So in his mentality, there was not a college future for me. But I went to Harold Washington, I went to Malcolm X, I got a certificate as a phlebotomist, and then I went into social work, which now I'm a social worker. So I think that's what is lacking, that our parents don't know about college, is not put in their head. So we're pushing them to, yes, enroll in college. Yes, there's a way to fill out this FAMSA form. I know it's difficult, but it's not hard. We're here to help you. I know that there's also programs that they could apply for, even if they have a DACA, they're DACA recipients. So we just want to promote them that continue going to college, don't end in the factory, don't end in the fields. I mean, it's enough of us working already out there. So the new generation should be more prepared than us. The new generation should be more doctors, more lawyers, more architects, more of everything, and less laborers.
And it sounds like it's changing mindsets there among youth, saying that these are not only things to aspire to, but things that you should think about definitely doing, that you shouldn't think about the alternative at all. Certainly a discussion we could go on for a long time, but our thanks to Solomon Martinez, Berto Aguayo, and Baltazar Enriquez. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And now to Brandis for analysis of today's proceedings in Derek Chauvin's murder trial. Brandis.
Paris, after a long day of closing arguments, the verdict of the Derek Chauvin trial is now in the hands of 12 jurors. The former Minneapolis police officer faces 3 charges for the death of George Floyd: second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. Joining us to explain these charges and to dive into closing arguments are Dan Herbert, attorney with Herbert Law Firm. He represented former Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke when he was on trial for the death of Laquan McDonald. And James Montgomery, attorney with James D. Montgomery and Associates. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Dan, let's start with you, please. What are the differences? What's the difference in these 3 charges?
Well, the difference in the charges is you can really focus on the intent aspect. With the second-degree murder, there is an intent requirement, and the intent is that Mr. Chauvin committed a felony while he was doing these actions. And of course, that was a big part of the trial and the evidence that went in. With regard to the third-degree murder, it's essentially that he committed an imminently dangerous act that wasn't authorized. And then the manslaughter is obviously a lower count than all 3 of those.
And because Derek Chauvin is a police officer, is one of those charges more difficult to prove than the others?
I would think that definitely the second degree is more difficult to prove, and I think the prosecutors recognize that by making sure that there was a third degree charge. The state did a very nice job of saying that these actions of being prone, having them prone and being on top of them were not authorized. So if they're not authorized, then the jury can conclude that there was an intent not to detain, but to punish.
James Montgomery, how did the prosecution make their closing arguments?
Well, the part that I saw indicated to me that he was extremely delicate with the jury. He was not he behaved as if he was speaking to people that didn't want to hear what he had to say. And I thought that was a wise move, because it's very difficult with a police client to get a jury to find them guilty. And I thought the way he went from the point of view of from the heart to what you saw on the black and white, and basically it was not a roughshod running prosecutor. He was a gentle gentleman who was trying to just share the facts with the jury in a way that was not challenging to what some of them may have a belief and that is that a policeman can do no wrong.
And we're going to come back to that closing argument in a second. But Dan, the defense has tried to sway the jury by debating the cause of death. What were they saying could have happened outside of Chauvin kneeling on Floyd's neck?
That was definitely their strongest argument. It was the use of force, and then it was the causation. Mr. Floyd had an enlarged heart, and then he ingested drugs. And then he had the evidence of an elevated blood pressure, certainly at that previous incident. So that's clearly what they're saying, is that the drugs and the elevated heart rate and the enlarged heart, those were substantial causal factors. I don't know if it will be effective with the jury, but that's essentially what they're saying.
Now, here's a clip from the prosecution today during closing arguments.
This case is exactly what you thought when you saw it first. When you saw that video, it is exactly that. You can believe your eyes. It's exactly what you believed. It's exactly what you saw with your eyes. It's exactly what you knew. It's what you felt in your gut. It's what you now know in your heart.
James, is this a compelling argument for the prosecution?
Absolutely. I think that is the most effective way to speak with this jury under these circumstances. Yes.
Why so? Why was this the most effective way?
Because it is not challenging their beliefs. It is challenging what you see, what you feel in your gut, and what you feel in your heart after looking at what happened on the video. It's not, typically what you find prosecutors doing is being self-righteous and law and order, etc., and tough. This gentleman handled it in a way that was palatable, in my opinion, with his jury, whether they will accept his argument or not.
Now, the defense argued that the prosecution wasn't showing a complete picture. Here's a look.
Throughout the course of this trial, you've seen us do this, right? Little snippets. A second here, a second there, a screenshot here, a screenshot there. You need to review the entirety of the evidence in this case during the course of your deliberations as well. And I can tell you that some of the videos that we've seen, they're much longer than what was presented in court.
Dan Herbert, will the jury believe that?
It's an excellent question. I don't think they will. But clearly, and I agree with my colleague on this, that if the prosecutors are trying to make this as simple as possible, there was a visceral reaction when people saw that tape, and the prosecutors want the jurors to just think about that visceral reaction, whereas the defense wants to really show all the elements and highlight this burden of proof and presumption of innocence. So it's definitely two different contrasting views here. And, I don't know. Here, I couldn't see the jury. I saw a lot of how the evidence went in, but as James will agree with me on, until you see those jurors and what points they're taking notes on and what points are resonating with them, it's really hard to predict what they're thinking.
James Montgomery, how do you think the makeup of the jury might impact the outcome of this case?
Well, I think it's a majority Caucasian jury, and therefore it'll affect the outcome quite a bit, because all you need is one or two of them to decide that they're not going to find him guilty of anything, and you'll have a hung jury. And unfortunately, in these kinds of cases, that happens more often than not. White jurors believe that the police officer is your friend, and indeed he is, and he's been their friend. Black folks, on the other hand, are afraid of the police and have good reason.
And before I let the two of you go, Dan Herbert, there have been many comparisons between this case and some others, and of course that of your former client, Jason Van Dyke, in the death of Laquan McDonald. How do you see it?
I was very close to the case with my client, obviously. I see them as polar opposites and very different from the two elements here. With our case, the cause of death was not at issue. In our case, I thought that there was a much more robust debate that could have been had with respect to the appropriateness of the use of force, whereas with Chauvin's case, the use of force issue was essentially a moot issue. And I think the defense recognized that, and they smartly devoted most of their arguments and attacks towards a causation prong in this.
Okay, and they both landed, of course, in the hands of jurors. We await the verdict from the Chauvin trial jury. In the meantime, my thanks to Dan Herbert and James Montgomery for joining us.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Brandis. James, take care.
You too.
Up next, expanded vaccine eligibility for Chicagoans, but hurdles remain. Stay with us for more.
It really is about community where we all come together.
Chicago needs to make space for everyone.
All Chicagoans over the age of 16 are now eligible to receive a COVID-19 vaccine. The city officially expanded access today, meeting President Joe Biden's April 19th deadline to open up the vaccination rollout to all American adults. But officials say demand still far outpaces supply, and issues of equitable distribution and hesitancy linger, especially as the Johnson & Johnson vaccine remains on pause here in the U.S. Here to share her insights are Dr. Marina Del Rios, an emergency room physician and Director of Social Emergency Medicine at the University of Illinois Hospital in Chicago. Dr. Del Rios, thanks for being back here with us.
Invitation.
So now that all adults are eligible here in Chicago, the question is, how long are folks going to be waiting or searching or clicking or refreshing their screens to find an appointment?
Well, I mean, I think it all is going to depend on how good your internet access is, how tech savvy you are, how much of a language barrier is an issue for you. And what we're going to see is that, once again, we're going to see the little progress that we had made with Protect Chicago Plus, with getting vaccines to communities of color and low-income communities. We're going to lose ground on that as we open up vaccine accessibility to everyone.
So you're saying that the more tech-savvy customers, now that it's open to all adults, will probably jump to the front of the line since they know how to use that. So then how do you make up for that in some of the communities that perhaps don't have that kind of access?
Well, I think that in parallel, we need to be investing in community-based organizations, in our federally qualified health centers, and ensuring that they have the resources that they need to get vaccines to those communities. And that means bridging the technology gap using healthcare workers or promotoras de salud, ensuring that there are sign-up systems that don't depend on people being fluent in English. And basically, short of knocking doors and just telling people sign up for your vaccine, or even bringing it to them if that's possible, which gets complicated with the fact that Johnson & Johnson is now on hold.
Right, and it's almost a race against time here, although Governor Pritzker says this latest surge of cases appears to start to be leveling off. So is Illinois at an inflection point here where perhaps the pace of vaccination can keep up or exceed the pace of this very, very contagious variant, the B.1.1.7 variant?
Well, my worry is that that pace really needs to keep up in all populations, right? So what we're seeing is that these 18 to 49 or so year olds that are now getting infected with COVID because of not because of choice, but because of manners of being exposed unnecessarily. Now will be more protected with the vaccines, but there's still going to be a lot of people that may not have as equal access to the vaccine and are still going to be showing up to work, exposing themselves, and not with the same level of protection. And so what I worry about is that if we don't keep up the pace with the COVID variants, what we may see is a return to some inequities in COVID cases.
So a lot of personal responsibility needs to take place to prevent that from happening. The mayor announced, kind of like the country, 50% of the city of Chicago has received a first dose, or somewhere around that. What does that tell you about when the city might be, or the state might be, ready for a full phase 5 reopening?
I would say that I like everyone else, can't wait for everything to go back to normal. But I think we just need to be cautious and wait out a little bit and see how this vaccine rollout to an expanded age group goes. And if we can, in fact, get vaccines to the communities and to the people that we know are at highest risk, it's not going to be very helpful to our population if all that are getting vaccinated are younger people who are healthy, and we're still leaving people that are vulnerable unprotected. So I think that before we move to phase 5, we need to be really cautious and see how well this vaccine distribution goes.
Do you anticipate the Johnson & Johnson vaccine getting approved again? And if so, how could that help efforts in Chicago?
I certainly hope so. I mean, the cases that came up that were complications were a very specific age group, right? And so what I foresee is that it may happen, as happens sometimes with medications, that there may be some restrictions, a warning for maybe restricting its use in, women in the ages of 18 to 40, for example, and still be safe to use in the elderly and in males. But we'll see. We'll have to see what the FDA decides upon and the CDC moving forward.
And in terms of being fully vaccinated, there's a lot of perhaps confusion out there among people about breakthrough cases, what the actual rate of breakthrough cases are, meaning cases of fully vaccinated individuals still contracting COVID-19. What is the rate based on the data that we have?
My understanding is that the rate is a lot less than 1%. I don't know the exact number, but it's very, very rare. And it's not unexpected. I mean, I think that what people should know is that with every vaccine, protection is not 100%, right? So no vaccine is going to guarantee that you won't get, for example, with the flu vaccine, there's no 100% guarantee that you won't get the flu. Same thing with measles, mumps, rubella, the vaccine against varicella, all of those. The important thing is that it prevents severe illness, which is really the 100% goal that all of these vaccines have and that they seem to achieve, that it's close to 100% protection to severe illness and death. A lot of the cases that have been breakthrough cases have been asymptomatic or minimally symptomatic, which is good. It means that the vaccine is working.
All right, Dr. Marina Del Rios, we thank you for joining us as always.
My pleasure.
And now, Brandis, we toss it back to you.
And Paris, thank you. One of the things I took away from that, especially, lots of folks waiting on when phase 5 can happen, but it sounds like obviously a lot more patience is still warranted. Still to come on Chicago Tonight, now that vaccinations are on the rise, will tourism bounce back in the city this summer? That and more from Cranes. As Chicago's transit agencies plot their recovery, a new RTA survey finds ongoing working from home could shift travel patterns and revenue. And a local child welfare nonprofit says an anti-racist approach has helped children of color find safe, permanent homes. But first, some more of today's top stories. Public health officials say nearly 2,000 more people have been diagnosed with the coronavirus since yesterday, and 22 have died. So far, more than 26% of residents have been fully vaccinated. Chicago Bulls legend Scottie Pippen shared the tragic news of his son's death via social media today. At 33 years old, Antron Pippen was Scottie's oldest son and once a top college prospect. Pippen said that if not for Antron's chronic asthma, he thinks he would have made it to the NBA. The oldest of Pippen's 7 children was an accomplished high school player in Georgia before playing college basketball at South Georgia Tech and Texas A&M International. And it's not a Chicago spring without snow. The weather forecast calls for an 80% chance tomorrow after 10 a.m., dropping to 30% later in the evening, then maybe areas of frost. That's right, frost after midnight tomorrow, with another chance of snow showers on Wednesday. It's going to get cold, too. Low of 32 overnight Tuesday. There's more of this story on our website. And happy spring, Chicago. Now to Paris for some of today's top business headlines. Paris.
Thanks, Brandis. A new deal for the controversial Foxconn development just north of the Wisconsin border. New signs of in-person work returning downtown as a trio of companies sign new leases for office space. And will tourism bounce back in the city this summer? Here to go behind the headlines is Crain's Chicago business reporter Danny Ecker. Danny, good to see you. First with that Foxconn story just north of the border in Pleasant Prairie. It was controversial because it got billions of tax breaks in Wisconsin years ago. Never really got off the ground. Now there's a new deal with current Governor Tony Evers. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, according to the Associated Press, we understand that basically whatever Foxconn is going to do is just going to be a lot smaller than the original plan. Remember, as you mentioned, a few years ago, the company was going to build a giant factory that made LCD screens for TVs and create 13,000 jobs. And in return, the state of Wisconsin was offering them about $4 billion with a B of incentives. Now they've apparently reached a deal to reduce that to about $10 million with an M. So we don't know yet what Foxconn will ultimately do in Wisconsin in the long run. They were reportedly working on a deal to build Google server components. They had manufactured some masks and ventilators last year, but it appears that what we can say at this point is that it's probably not going to be anywhere near the eighth wonder of the world that President Trump called it back in 2018.
And those incentives they're going to get now are just a minuscule fraction of what was originally offered. All right, back here in Chicago, 3 companies are either signing new leases or expanding their downtown office space. Whereabouts is that happening? And do you take this as a sign that the market could be improving?
Well, it's definitely improving. I think we're far from where we ought to be and where we will be later in the year, but you know, the office leasing wheels seem to be turning again. We wrote today about deals that got done in recent weeks. One was, the biggest one was a company called Lactalis, which is a French company that bought Kraft Heinz's natural cheese business last year. They signed a 35,000 square foot sublease in the West Loop. In the East Loop, a company called Impact Networking expanded their space by 30,000 feet. And in the Fulton Market District, a company called Technion, which makes office furniture, they signed a 22,000 square foot lease. So, and by the way, all of this was on the heels of Kimberly Clark signing a big deal last week in Fulton Market, or announcing it last week. So it's a big sea change, really, compared to what the past year has delivered in terms of new office leasing. And certainly it's a sign that companies are preparing to return to offices in greater numbers later this year.
And certainly things that Loop officials want to see happening, and I'm sure they're glad that that's happening. Okay, lastly, tourism. The city really depends on that in good years. They hope to get it going in the summer, but the city's tourism arm is losing some of its top executives. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's not the best time to be having a leadership gap at the Tourism Bureau. We had news a few weeks ago that Choose Chicago is not renewing the contract of its CEO, David Whitaker, which expires in July. And then we just got news late last week that his number 2, Mark Anderson, who's one of the veterans at Choose Chicago, is leaving to lead tourism efforts for the city of San Antonio. So it's really at a time when the city needs its tourism arm to be firing on all cylinders. It's missing some, going to be missing some leaders, and it also has a slashed budget and a reduced staff. And on top of that, they're trying to send the message that the city's open for fun, but also, trying to make sure it's a safe and inviting place to be. So there's some creativity to be done here to take advantage of what a lot of people think will be a really strong summer for leisure travel.
It's certainly going to be a heavy job for whoever takes those positions over. All right, Danny, thank you very much.
Thanks, Paris.
It's the open question that all transit agencies wish they could peer into the crystal ball and answer. How many riders will come back to the trains and buses after the pandemic? Well, new data says that number could be around 80% of pre-pandemic levels. That's according to a survey of 5,600 transit riders just released by the Regional Transportation Authority, which oversees CTA, Metra, and PACE. And joining us to talk about the report and next steps for transit agencies is Leanne Redden, Executive Director of the Regional Transportation Authority. Leanne, welcome back here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, well, let's look at some of the findings in the study that you put out. First of all, the key findings here, about half of people who haven't been taking transit expect to keep working from home 2 or more days a week. Even after the pandemic, transit trips were skipped altogether and not replaced by car travel. That's another thing you found. And riders' priorities, in addition to health and safety, are the kinds of things people always look for: improved speed, reliability, and better connections. So let's start with these numbers. 80%, that's a pretty good number, although when you look at folks deciding that they might stay home 1 or 2 days a week and come back to the office 3 days, what is that going to mean for ridership and the revenue that you get from passenger fares?
Well, ultimately, though, I think you're right. It is good news, and we're encouraged to hear that. You mentioned we don't have a crystal ball, so it's good to have some data behind what we've been thinking about, what we've been looking at. I think people see the light at the end of the tunnel. We do see, expect a vast majority of the riders to come back. But as you point out, yes, there will be people that may not come back or may not be coming back as frequently as they may have pre-pandemic. And I think we were seeing some of that previous to the pandemic, but I think that's going to continue to play out. So as I think everybody knows, we rely on fare revenue as part of our operating revenue. So we're going to have to think carefully about what the future looks like and manage our budgets appropriately.
So could that be reduced schedules, especially during rush hour when you tend to run, trains and buses every 10, 15 minutes?
I don't think we're there at that point. I think one thing the pandemic has shown us that transit is absolutely critical to our region's economy, to opportunities for people around the region to get to and from work. So that is not anything we're contemplating at this point. In fact, we're actually planning to ramp up service, and past couple of weeks, Metro have been doing that as they've seen a bit of an uptick in ridership. So I think it's something we'll continue to look at. This study was really our first through sort of outreach to our riders during the pandemic. And we're going to use that as we plan our recovery work going forward over the next couple of months.
All right, so we mentioned at the top some of the things that you surveyed riders and users on for what they want to see when they come back. What were some of those things that you found, some of the top answers that you got on that?
Well, I think we heard loudly and clearly that people want to be assured that the transit system is safe, reliable, and ultimately clean. That's something really important coming out and recovering from a pandemic. And we heard that loudly and clearly. And the majority of people who are riding agree with those sentiments. So our job is now to communicate that to people that are considering coming back. I think some of the other stuff that we heard from people were making sure that we're investing into the transit system, so the infrastructure, so it is reliable, can operate efficiently, that we can give them better, customer information so they can make choices about their trips. And so those are the things we're going to continue to look at investing in the transit system in the coming years.
The stimulus money you've got, how long is that going to last before you need riders to come back to the full sort of pre-pandemic level? And can you use that for some of those investments?
So yeah, we are working through our budgets right now. We are good financially through the end of this year. The infusion of federal relief dollars helped us fill the budget gaps for 2021. We, in the coming couple of months, will start the work for planning for the budgets for 2022. So again, that's part of our ongoing conversation. We know we can stretch the relief dollars into 22, but the future does look uncertain. No one has a crystal ball. We can't exactly predict how long recovery is going to take. So we have to be prudent and responsible. And I think the three operators, CTA, Metro, and Pace, have done a really good job through the pandemic. And we're all working we're very closely for planning for the future.
Speaking of planning for the future, you've got a possible $2 trillion infrastructure bill coming from Congress and President Biden. If they do pass that, what could that mean for RTA?
That would be fantastic for us. I mean, we've been talking for a long time about the need to invest in the physical infrastructure, and that we have, over a $20 billion backlog of aged assets and infrastructure that we have across the transit network. So those dollars would be a huge win for our region and really help us chip away at that backlog, again, with a focus on sort of safety and reliability in the existing transit network to ensure that we're here as the recovery continues and to support this region's economy.
Getting back to the survey that you put out, you kind of got a better picture of who the riders of Metro, Pace, and CTA are. A lot of folks that are essential workers. Tell us more about those findings.
So a lot of this, that was information we sort of knew something about, and some of it was anecdotal, but we were able to confirm that the essential workers are the lion's share of our riders. It's really been heroes transporting heroes, but also I think some of the riders have been largely Black and Latino, and people having low incomes. And so again, it's highlighting the necessity of the transit system and how it's been absolutely critical to surviving the pandemic for all of us, that even those who are working at home, but also critical for our recovery.
Absolutely. It's the lifeblood of the region. And Leanne Redden, thank you for being here. Thanks as always for joining us. And up next, how to create equal opportunities for Black and Latino foster children. But first, we take a look at the weather.
Caring for a child in the foster care system can be a complicated and emotional experience. Differences in race and culture within that relationship can make it an even more challenging endeavor. But local child welfare nonprofit Lutheran Child and Family Services says new analysis shows taking an anti-racist approach to foster care can help improve outcomes for Black and Latino children. Joining us with more is Beverly Jones, Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of Lutheran Child and Family Services. Thank you so much for joining us, Beverly. Can you first explain to us a little bit about what your organization does?
We're an agency that has been around for over 140 years, starting out as an orphanage. We're a nonprofit who basically provides services to children and families through a number of programs, the largest being foster care.
Okay. And so we've learned 54% of roughly 21,000 children in Illinois foster care are Black or Latino. Of course, presumably your organization was already accustomed to working with children and families of color, but what made you realize that you needed to change your approach?
Data is powerful, and when we looked at the percentage of children of color who were achieving what we call permanency or leaving foster care to either go back with their parents or be adopted, we saw data that was embarrassing and unacceptable. When we began this journey, it was 4% of children of color were leaving foster care to go to a loving forever family.
And I think we're gonna get to the change from 4%, what the improvement was. But how did you put that change of approach into practice? What steps did you all take?
We did some what I call foundational work. We started with looking at what does it mean to be an anti-racist organization? What does that look like? What commitment do we want to make to the public as well as, and more directly to the children and families we serve? So we now have an organizational statement around this. We all participated in a anti-racism training.
Anti-racism training.
Yeah, training together, which really gave us a common framework and concepts and language to think about and talk about. We had workshops and all staff meetings devoted to this subject about biases and implicit biases, and what does that look like, and how does it show up in our work day to day. Those are a few things we did. And then we set a goal that we wanted to tackle the disparity around children achieving permanency and how long it took for them to leave foster care and go with a loving forever family.
Yeah, let's get to some of those results because some of them are positive. So for both Black and Latino youth, you're showing an increase in achieving permanency and a reduction in the amount of time spent in foster care. Now, that drop in time in care for Latino youth was especially large. What do you think accounts for that?
We're still exploring that and looking at that. So this is what staff have shared with us. One is listening better to families. We have bilingual staff to serve Spanish-speaking children and families. Looking at both parents, if children are only living with one, also engaging the other parent and that side of the family as resources for this child. And I think just paying attention to how we talk to people, the language we use to describe their circumstances as well as themselves, all have contributed to our success.
Why is it important that children spend less time in a foster care setting versus in a permanent home?
Foster care, when it was first created or established in this country, always says this is a temporary arrangement. And what we know about child development and success in life is that you need a lifetime support line, regardless of how old you are. And that foster care is meant as temporary. Where do I belong? Where can I go when I'm in trouble or sad, or even when I'm celebrating something? There's nothing like the joy of family. And for many of our children, they were missing that.
And in the few seconds that we've got left, Beverly, what advice do you have for other organizations that need to tackle a similar issue?
I think you have to start somewhere, move past the words to action. There is no, blueprint for you to follow. We share what we're doing as a way of saying, here are some ideas, but the importance is action and moving past words. Children deserve more than what we're providing at the moment, and we should all be outraged by that and determined to tackle this issue.
Okay. Beverly Jones, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And that's our show for this Monday night.
Please join us tomorrow night live at 7. Aldermen weigh in on the release of body cam footage showing police fatally shooting 13-year-old Adam Toledo.
And vibrant portraits on fabric at the Art Institute add layers to American history. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you so much for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Closed captioning for this program is brought to you by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, dedicated to preserving the dignity and rights of all individuals.